Welcome to the fourth session of the summit. My name is Mark Etherington, and I'm your host today for this session on unearthing challenges in data quality. I'm joined today by Lee Kafafian, who's the head of development at Soros, Rebecca Kelly, head of technical evangelism at KX, and Rizwan Saeed, head of sales engineering at Finborn. Craig Stelmach is our SVP of business development at WeatherSource, and I'd like to get the ball rolling by inviting our panelists to give us a little bit more insight into what their organization does, their role, and why data quality is important to them. So Rebecca, if you could kick us off, please.
Great, thank you very much. Very happy to be here today joining this great panel. So my name is Rebecca. I work for KX. I'm a technical evangelist. KX is the company, we do a lot of things, but I suppose for the purposes of today, we help our customers with streaming analytics, and we actually provide the world's fastest time series database as well. So we've got a wealth of customers in the financial space, but more recently we're getting a lot of new customers in manufacturing, automation, and also Formula One and all of those sorts of exciting new arenas. I spend a lot of my time talking with our customers about their challenges, what they're facing, what they're kind of doing next, and data quality is a sort of a consistent recurring theme. So very happy to be here and to kind of share some of the insights I've seen across the industry.
Fantastic. Lee, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. I'm Lee Kafafian. I am the head of application and software development for Soros Fund Management. For those of you who don't know, it's a family office that's run out of primarily New York City. Obviously, with the role that I have, I cover a lot of areas, probably do less hands-on coding than I did earlier in my tenure, and I manage a lot of folks, but a lot of that revolves around keeping data pipelines open and working and having fairly rigid process, whether it's in the data space or the operation space or the technical operations space. So this type of material obviously is of interest to me. It's practical and it applies to every day what I deal with. One of my mentors once said that most problems that we deal with at an organization like ours, a hedge funds, are data problems. Rarely do we really have problems with RAM or CPU on machines any longer, right? So many times what we're dealing with is data and data quality and how we serve our users, which has morphed a little bit in the last couple of years from really pure technologists to maybe a little bit of a subset of other folks inside my business who are consumers of data, but maybe don't have the same technical background that mainstream developers do. So I'm looking forward to the discussion here.
Oh, awesome. I tend to agree. Data is by far the biggest cause of issues and also the biggest gain that we can get out of the world if we can do it correctly. Lee, same question to yourself, please. Sorry, not Lee. So Rizwan.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Rizwan here from Finborn Technology. I run sales engineering at our organization. So I'm very much involved with kind of working with clients to kind of get them onto our platform and help them understand how we can help solve their problems. So Finborn, as a company, we were founded with kind of a mission to kind of structurally reduce the cost of investing and increase transparency within the asset management industry. What we've done is kind of built a foundational technology that is focused on solving one of the major challenges that industry has, which is data and how do you kind of manage and curate and look after your data. And our general view is if we can solve that data challenge this industry has as a whole, we can instead help solve and reduce the cost of investing across the spectrum. So in my role, I kind of talk a lot with clients, and we find that a lot of the challenges they have tend to be around kind of the disparate data sets, kind of normalizing data sets, aggregating data sets, and then trying to get some kind of meaningful insights out of those once they get them into Lucid. So today, hopefully, I'll be able to share some of my experience and learnings that we've had in talking to our clients.
I think certainly from my own perspective, if I had $1, £1, €1 for every time I've had to fight with a investment books and record systems over my career, is when I think I would have retired by now. So I fully endorse the approach that you guys are doing. And last but not least, Craig, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Mark, and happy to be here today at this what's looking to be a great panel. So it's Craig Stelmach, Senior Vice President of Business Development at WeatherSource. WeatherSource is a provider of analytics-grade global weather information, essentially weather information anywhere you have an asset on any landmass in the world and up to 200 miles offshore. We are a markedly different provider of weather information than a traditional weather provider because we really are not only focused on the forecast, but we're really focused on bringing a continuum of weather information so that people in businesses and organizations can really create weather strategies and create business intelligence around weather-based risk mitigation. My day-to-day activities are driving revenue and strategic partnerships for the company. And so I'm regularly talking with customers and getting an understanding of what are their concerns about latency, what are their concerns about data quality, where will they take a trade-off on latency for something like for quality. So regularly engaged. And at WeatherSource, it's very imperative that we have excellent data quality because we power a majority of Fortune companies, a tremendous amount of asset managers in the financial firm, and they are making real-time decisions in business intelligence that can have an impact not only on their business, but also potentially loss of life. If we serve up an incorrect weather value about severe weather that's about to hit a manufacturing facility, they make a decision based on that weather information, and that weather information is wrong, there could very well be some catastrophic outcomes. So data quality is of tremendous importance to WeatherSource, and something that we really started when we founded the company is one of our key pillars of our success.
And I just want to say, just because a number of us from the UK, that is not the reason Craig's on here. We don't just want to talk about the weather, but it's going to be the insight that you get out of this as we go along with it. Craig, can we stick with, I mean, you mentioned something as we're going through this, as we get into like exploring the topic. Talk to us more about the latency and the accuracy, because you don't typically view, the weather's easier. You look out, I mean, trivially, you look out the window, you've got the sensors. Talk to us about latency and how it connects in with the accuracy and the use of it in the trading community.
Yeah, so there's always a balancing act between latency and accuracy in data quality. Our goal is to deliver data that is accurate to the best of our ability in as quick a manner as possible, and particularly being able to deliver data that we don't have to correct downstream at a later time. It's very difficult to go to a systematic trader or some other type of company that's ingested massive amounts of our data, is running processes and has automated processes that are relying on that data. So there's always that balancing act, and it's very difficult for us to go back downstream because now we have to basically have version control, we have to have a customer notification, and we have patching. So we're always trying to deliver that data as quick as we can with the highest quality and the highest level of accuracy. Now, there is also a trade-off, though, as I said. Some clients, like short-term traders, they're focused on reduction of latency because they want to get that information in their hands and into their trading processes and to their analysts in advance of the general public and their competition. So they really want that data. They'll sacrifice a little bit on data quality to be able to get that data in their hands immediately and with very low latency, versus somebody like a fundamental trader or somebody with a long-term view who's looking for really trends and patterns. They're going to want to have as accurate data as possible so that their trend expectations and what they're modeling is as accurate as possible so they can make those longer-term decisions and longer-term business intelligence. But it is a balancing act, and we're constantly working on reducing latency. And we do things like we have prioritization of our data processing queues. So for customers like short-term traders and systematic traders, we're pushing that data into their hands as soon as possible. In setting up elegant architecture where we actually we're putting facilities and infrastructure in close proximity to the inputs of these assets so we can pull it in and then deliver it as quickly as possible. But it's always with weather information, bringing in billions and billions of rows of data on a daily basis, it's always a challenge, data quality and latency.
It's interesting. I think in the world, whether you're a consumer or a supplier, the accuracy, the trade-offs are absolutely critical and very difficult to define. Lee, Soros, okay, family fund, very, very different in theory than WeatherSource as an organization. Do you care about different things? How do you think about this space in terms of accuracy?
Sure. I think, one of the things I'd say for us is there's such a broad scope of data sets that are meaningful. So, what we've learned over time is to handle maybe some data sets a little bit differently than others. There's a case for, an incoming data set. Let's say it's like a broker availability file or something, and like it's a large data set, and maybe it's one of those type of data sets that just we want an all or none type of thing. So it fails to load. There's data quality. We ask for a new file and we reload it. I think, piggybacking off of what Craig says there, if you have sort of people waiting along the data pipeline, if you have some dependencies, it's not always in your best interest to just sort of say one record has failed. Let me just throw the whole data set out. And what we've learned is that, our ability to execute in a timely manner may require us to take a larger data set or something that we've manifested internally as a data set and acknowledge that there is an operational problem. There are 2 or 3 rows that are problematic. Notify those who need to be notified, but continue to let the data flow. We still have processes that take some time to run sometimes, and it's important that things get done on time. And what we found is that even in our best efforts, getting up in the 24/7, notifying a vendor, asking for another file, we still would fall behind. So what we've developed is a series of sort of quality control checks along the way. And so there are certainly non-starters for data. If we get large amounts of records that are just like have a bad FX rate or something, and we just absolutely can't use the data, that's one thing. But in cases where there are a couple operational pieces around the edges, there are critical data sets that we've learned to sort of identify the problem, move it out to the parties, usually our trade support or reference data teams, let them take a look at it and deal with it with the vendor behind the scenes while the rest of the process goes on. I use the analogy of like 50,000 records and one, cash balance for $100 is off. You're really hurting yourself by throwing that entire data set and saying, hey, this is no good, right? The data is actually pretty good and we can do a lot with that. Our consumers someone might only be interested in cash balances. Someone might only be interested in equities, right? So we have to consider our audience. And although it may seem a little unnatural to sort of not stop the assembly line, it does make sense for us at times to sort of do quality control on the fly, send out notifications, and let the process move on. One of the more interesting pieces of what's evolved, sort of combining data quality analysis with sort of staying on schedule and being able to put certain things out so that further consumers downstream can get to them.
That's interesting. I think what we're seeing this at Crux as well, because you end up with, the first thing is everyone's different. Yeah, it's like the tolerance for pain or the tolerance for insight, whichever way you want to look at it, is different almost in every person, certainly every client we speak to. So that calibration doesn't feel as if there feels like there's a set of egregious things that need to be checked, and then you don't pass go unless you get X. But the rest of it, we see a wide gamut of folks that want instant notification that their data's ready. They want it, they want to use it, they want to get ahead of it. They're willing to live with possibly the downside of that. And there's some discussion about how much insight they get, versus the folks who actually know this is a quarterly process. I want you to run the validations. I want you to double check that actually all the I's and T's are dotted and crossed appropriately before I get there. So I think it's an interesting dilemma for all of us, as we've certainly for us in terms of how we build a utility around this in order to actually work out how do we give optionality. Before we get too much into like the architectural stuff that comes back with this, Rebecca, so are there a set of basics that you would look for in a supplier? What does Craig need to make sure before he gives you his data? Yeah. What sort of things are you looking for?
Are you ready for my list, Craig? Well, there's lots of different things, I suppose. And at the very kind of surface level, you're looking for things like accuracy, completeness, consistency. But I do think that what Craig was talking about before and the timeliness is actually so pivotal and important, particularly for a lot of our clients who are working in the kind of high volume, high velocity space. But I sort of think of it as, and I've come to refer to it as like a data half-life, right? There's only a certain amount of time for which you can really extract meaningful value out of a lot of data sets. And it's been kind of a recurring theme. Like certainly in finance, there was a bit of a gold rush, let's say, to all the alternative data sets. And what's kind of happened there is actually a lot of people have kind of come back to the data pipeline aspect of it, understanding that, you know, while there might be very meaningful information in this data set, the crux is really how do we get the information out of it in a way that is within that kind of time horizon. Yeah, so I think from a supplier perspective, I am seeing a trend of a lot of, you know, what's the expression? If Muhammad can't go to the mountain, you can't bring the mountain to Muhammad, Muhammad has to go to the mountain. I see a lot of people kind of, well, in clients in general, people are moving to cloud-based environments a lot. And so there's a lot of kind of infrastructure being built up and suppliers moving to these environments to make sure that they can get the lowest latency really possible to still serve those needs of their customers. And yeah, if we're gonna really give Craig a hard time, I think you know, the sort of timelines on the resolution side when things do get identified as problematic, that's a big part, and the associated kind of governance that comes with that. So kind of identifying it, resolving it, and doing that in the shortest amount of time possible, it tends to be quite influential for customers. Yeah.
Quite interesting. I don't know if any of you guys were able to catch some of the earlier conversations today and some of the other sessions. There was an interesting one on the trialing process, yeah, where I think effectively, they came up, I think it was the homeowners report, yeah, which I haven't heard the term for many years. But if you think about like I think we've been toying with the idea of like Carfax for data, yeah, where you can actually start thinking about what's the minimum quality measure. What should be expected? I think there are some issues in the industry in terms of just the vernacular around this. You need to understand, you know, what is the measure of good quality. Now, I think where Lee's going is that it can differ because of your business process, which is absolutely fine. But I think there's probably room for something where, you know, at least there's the stats, like there's this many nulls in a column. Yeah, and then your tolerance can be driven as a metric effectively, because validations are largely metrics anyway, to be blunt. But if you think about these, yeah, it feels as if there may be room for like the minimum standard that we expect, not just, I'm teasing Craig about being the supplier, but the reality is most people that have data, that consume data, end up being suppliers of data. And that's the way the economy seems to be going largely. So as part of that, we all need to care about this. I think there's some interesting problems around utility versus specificity of your actual problem. Riz, you're not a big consumer. Yeah, I know you guys are trying to curate the absolute pan-galactic version of eyeball, but in terms of the data sets you take in a lot of data. So in terms of what are the challenges and problems that you've seen in this space as well?
Yeah, I mean, so very much Finborn sees out from our perspective, we probably more on the consumer side. We take in, like you say, very many disparate data sets across the spectrum from the investment process. So, you know, custodian files, on accountant fees, reference data, market data, alternative data. And the challenge that our clients have is, you know, not only do they get the different types of data, they get the same types of data from different vendors. And they need to then kind of figure out how do we then aggregate these data sets together and then use them for our internal kind of views. And so I think that's where some of the problems that we're seeing. And one of the things that we find that you kind of need to do on the consumer side is very much make sure that you have flexibility in your platforms. So flexibility to take in unknown data sets you haven't seen before, and be able to capture the full details and not throw data away and retain the fidelity, because what you don't need today, you might need 6 months down the line when your traders start trading new asset classes. So alongside just kind of the different data sets, you know, we're also finding that suppliers are getting quite, I'll put it slightly, they're getting quite rigorous around knowing how clients are using their data. So that means that things like data entitlements and data security and who has access to data and how it's redistributed. And from a consumer perspective, you can need platforms that kind of give you those as first-class concepts and make it very easy for you to control the data flowing within your organization. And then what you want to do is have access to your data, right? We see a lot of platforms out there which once the data goes in, it's a black box and it's very hard to get it back out. So we very much believe in having kind of open APIs and access to your data. Again, fully entitled, fully with full data security models around that. So I think what we want to focus on is making sure that, you know, a lot of our clients, they have quite, although they operate in the same space, they have very customized workflows. And so what we need to make sure is that consumer platforms allow clients to curate data solutions that fit their needs, give them the flexibility. So like I say, they can bring in lots of different data sets, they can join them together and produce standardized, homogeneous views over those data sets. And tools like ours, like Lucid, we kind of give them the tool set to kind of do that and give them and add value that way, I think.
No, I mean, it's been fun. I mean, just for the rest of the audience, we've actually done a bit of work with Thimble and we're integrating some of our data sets that we distribute really easily. And it was actually a joy to see just the integration came together, thankfully. Piece ran very well in terms of how we did it. But what I really liked about it was the way of bringing the disparate data sets together. That mechanism that you have in Lucid is actually really cool. I think it's an interesting, so a shameless plug for tomorrow. There's a session tomorrow on data enrichment. And it's interesting because I think, whilst a lot of the conversations, obviously there's a huge upsurge in alternate as people are trying to find other means to get signal in terms of what we're doing, but it does intersect a bit with what we're doing here because I almost felt as if what you want to say is we need to enrich it so that we can join it and integrate it. And to do that, you need a baseline of quality that comes out of your system. So you can't really start doing integration unless you've actually sort of cleaned the data or at least prepped the data in one-off basis. So there's a session tomorrow that explores some of that. And I'd urge people to dial in for it. There's a very interesting story from the way RepRisk have approached this area over the years. Just before we go on, just want to remind the audience, please, if you've got questions for the panel, please put it into the system. We will take those at the end. If not, no worries. But if you do want a question, please raise it. So I'm going to move on just a little bit. And in a summary, Alice, you go a little bit backwards about this, because I know when we got together to talk about the topic beforehand, there was actually quite a good conversation around data architecture. Now, my background's in that many years ago with the banks, and almost the golden rule, and this is almost like your golden source conversation, Rizwan, yeah, in terms of make sure you've got the really good quality. The problem is that with data architecture principles say fundamentally change data at source, don't change data downstream. Okay, it's sort of like cardinal rule one. And I've heard Rebecca saying, hey, listen, we need to make the process to change the source, which is fine. And I'm sort of hearing Lee say, actually, we may override that. That one bad row, I'm not going to go and have it fixed. I need to do something with it. So I'm going to put out the heretical view that perhaps that principle is wrong. And Lee, for case for the prosecution, what sort of examples have you got in terms of when should data architecture rules be broken and why?
Yeah, I think it sort of piggybacks off the original point I made regarding sort of the close inspection and the notification to sort of consumers, right? I think if you get a data set in and it is so critical to the timeline of the daily business workflow, not only capturing it, but there is an argument and there are cases for correcting them sort of on the fly or in real time. I think I'll come out and I'll say that in a confident way. But one of the things I would say is that it is a little bit of a last resort. I agree principally that you always want the best, highest quality data coming in cases where it's holding up a series of operational issues, or it could cause a large skew in a meaningful analytic that would be traded on. There are some cases where we do some overrides, and we have it's a well-defined process. It's not something you do in a way that is doesn't have proper audit, doesn't have proper transparency. But if you're going to take it on, it can really be an additional grease that keeps things moving. And again, many times it is to stay on a business timeline. Having a firm sit around and wait a couple hours for a data rerun or something like that can really be detrimental. And so sometimes there is a case for overrides. To that point, getting into sort of like, what is that case? Okay. So I think if you've got a primary data set that's being held up, you've notified people accordingly, like, hey, we're letting these two records go. There are cases where we'll make some overrides. A couple facts around that. One of them is we never override a value that has come in from a source. So it's always a delta adjustment. So if someone says, if a data source says the market value is $100, and we know, quite frankly, it's $100,000, there's a delta adjustment on that is fully transparent, audited, and also would have some subsequent reporting down line that we made that change. So you can see just from what I defined that it's not something you do sort of behind the scenes with a SQL statement as much as you invest in a process to keep your workflows going in a way that has the right kind of supporting infrastructure. So by its very nature, if you're willing to invest in those controls and process around the override, you're saying this is important enough to do it. There are many, many cases where we opt for a new data set from the provider or something like that. But there are those cases where we find that a simple override can save us a lot of time, keep us on schedule, and again, take a large set of data that only has a few outliers and bring it into the state that we want to keep it and go forward with the rest of our process. You can imagine an override. Yeah, imagine an override system where 80% of your data needed to be overwritten. That would be crazy, right? But if it's one or two cases a week or a month, this can really keep the wheels greased and keep things moving and really avoid a lot of. I always have this vision in my head of an old sort of like conveyor belt and sort of assembly line operation. Every time you pull the lever to shut down that assembly line, everyone working loses, right? So if you can make small adjustments on the fly via overrides, it can be a pretty resourceful way of keeping things moving. It's not the ideal state, and in our case, it often is the result of maybe a couple of cases where we kind of look back and say, if we would have just changed that value, we wouldn't have lost all this time and we wouldn't have had to go back and do all that. And they usually take a couple iterations before it's identified as that type of case. And again, they're used sparingly, but it is an option that I found. I think from a data purist, does it rub me a little bit the wrong way? Yeah, it does a little bit. But at the same time, we all got to come to work and do a job. And one thing that no matter how much I try to do technically, I can never create more time in the day. And that's usually the deciding factor. If I'm going to lose or fall behind on a process, it becomes part of the conversation.
Well, you can always invent a time machine, but yeah, as a principle, I agree with you. I think what's interesting about that, I think there's a real nugget in there, and that delta analysis. Because I was actually talking to Rizwan about this. Riz, do you want to talk about how Finborn do this too? Because I think there's a really good analogy here in terms of the approaches you guys have taken.
Yeah. So again, going back to this idea of data quality and data sources coming in, quite often clients need to kind of figure out what's the golden source, or is there a golden source even for the data set? And we've implemented this kind of event-driven architecture. So again, we never lose any data within the system. We can consistently reproduce the state of the system at any point in time. So in the context of bad data coming in, you have the bad data, which is, if you sent a client report out with the bad data and you need to reproduce it after you've corrected it, you can kind of roll the clock back and go back to that gold data. But if you need corrected data for investment trading decisions or subsequent reporting, you have the corrected data as well. So the idea with what we have is that give clients the flexibility to have all representations of the data, apply entitlements on top of it, and that way your organization can control the views that you have within that of that data set, right? So if you want to have people who only have access to perfect signed off data, entitle them to just see that data, but store the underlying data at the highest possible fidelity. So for those people that need to make the snap decisions straight away on the raw data, they've got access to it as well if they're allowed to. Yeah. So it's the pattern that we see with a lot of our clients.
Yeah, the delta analysis piece is key. Rebecca.
Yeah. No, you could sense I was hoping to chime in. I think that's entirely it. You've got to kind of work with the bitemporality of the data, really. Overriding is a word that makes me nervous, because the thing is that most people that do solve this problem are doing exactly this, where they're not changing the value that was originally recorded. It's a case of recording a new one and maybe deprecating a flag or something like that to sort of indicate this is no longer relevant. But certainly in finance, and I mean, I think it applies everywhere, maybe just less on the regulatory side in other industries. But there is a need to be able to sort of justify the actions that were taken at a given time, and those are taken with the data that's available to you at that time. So it's important to kind of maintain that consistency. I know we tackle this a lot through kind of an action tracker type of flow, right? So something needs to be done, something looks unusual, some alert is triggered to say, oh, this looks a bit unusual. It gets escalated through, there's very clear kind of workflows for who's going to remediate this, what the actions taken were, and then, ultimately you sort of can track the full kind of life cycle of that change, which isn't really a change, which is an addition.
It's a delta. I think the key word of the day is delta.
Yes.
And we should be using that as like,
exactly.
House in need of DIY enthusiasts. That's the delta is the new change. Great, gaps. Okay, because I presume that the government's infrastructure for sensing weather is not perfect. How do you guys handle when you don't have the data which you've got to supply?
Sure. So that's a very interesting point, Mark. Up to 25% of data coming in from government-run inputs, such as satellite, radar, or observation station, routinely have errors. And customers are really calling for gap-free continuums of data. So with weather data, our data quality really starts with a detailed understanding of the incoming sources of our data. Obviously, we can't go back to a satellite or a radar and say, hey, we think this value that you just served us is wrong. So we have to really be able to develop methodologies and strategies for dealing with those data quality issues kind of in real time as it comes in. Because again, we're bringing in from so many disparate sources, thousands and thousands of sources, including, we're talking telematics data coming in for automatic windshield wipers from 40 million cars, all in real time, and being able to process that to geocoded reference of the car, correlate that to the relational database of what is the activity of the wiper swipes, and then correlate that to the weather that's occurring at that precise location. So, we've always got problems with the data coming in, but we have developed a lot of different processes and methodologies, and it all comes down to really strategy is key. So we'll use tools like Snowflake, and to Rebecca's point, everything going to the cloud and ecosystems like Snowflake that are really allowing us to bring in massive volumes of data, quickly scan that input data and identify gaps and null values, and then being able to pull that into our platform for where with actual values, we leverage overlapping sources of weather information. So we can use things like real-time forecast to basically create a bounding around that forecast, like a deviation, like 1 degree of deviation, like a rubber band, and essentially say, okay, for this particular location at this point in time, applying meteorological context to this value, this is what the value should be at this location. So we're always within our gridded data, always using companion data sets and meteorological context that says, okay, it can't snow when it's 7 degrees Fahrenheit, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So we know that that value is erroneous. So we're able to then flag that as suspect, isolate that, and bring that in for review. But that's very, very difficult to do because we bring in all of these disparate inputs and then we have to unify those. So being able to unify those in real time, things like satellite and radar in eking weather information or occultations from satellite or cell towers, very, very difficult to do that at scale because at the same time, we're having to homogenize those with the other inputs. But, hats off to our technical team. We do it, and we do it every day, and we do it extremely effectively. So
I mean, again, I can't believe the weather is really interesting. So for all of those doubters out there, I'm actually don't know if I'm more concerned about where the windscreen wiper or information on my car's going now versus but the amount of integration you've got to do is huge. So I mean, I think there's probably a couple of hours of conversation here because when you start thinking about, I mean, you mentioned Snowflake, great for non-material. I mean, it's not so much the DB, it's the fact that it's a shared environment, yeah? I think that comes back a little bit to what Riz was talking about as well, because we're seeing a big uptick, whether you're playing the Snowflake game or you want to go into Amazon and you want to actually just take the data from their exchange directly into Redshift, whether you're on Microsoft and you want to do a share into Synapse, or indeed, much like what we do, we use BQ extensively as well as all of those, and we share data using that. So that sharing mentality it puts an even more onus on the quality of the person sharing it, or the quality of the process that distributes it, which is why we're obviously very interested in this. Because if you're going to share something, there's nothing like annoying everybody at the same time with bad data on a shared basis. Very efficient way of really annoying everybody. So I think there's some challenges here of actually how we integrate all the entitlements to raise your point about it, because you've got to share it safely, but also make sure it's got core quality. Now, I'm conscious of time and where we're going with this. So there's a couple of things that are coming out of this, I think, which are really important, certainly in terms of the delta analysis. The one thing we haven't touched on is really anomalies, in terms of it. So many of us live for the world of removing anomalies. Craig, I know you've got almost the counter version of that, of trying to embrace anomalies. I mean, I'd start the conversation, we've been living in, what's our tolerance for change? For those of us in the States, we've been living in the world of alternate facts for many years. We're coming out of that world. Is there a different set of interpretations? Where would you put the line? Riz, I'm going to turn this on to you. How do you think about tolerances for quality? I know you've given the bitemporal thing was interesting, but do you see clients actively expecting you to manage that for them? Do you expect them to give you the information to do it? Where do you try and draw the line on what you think, let's say Finborn's basic quality point is?
I think for us, it comes back to this idea of kind of flexibility with clients and not necessarily imposing a data model or a particular workflow on clients. So when we talk about in the context of kind of quality, if we take, for example, kind of custodian data, a lot of our clients work with, they'll take in custodial data from multiple sources, with different sets of identifier schemes. But what they need to do is kind of knit those together. And how do you interpret what those transaction codes mean that come in on these feeds, right? Because custodian A may call it a buy, custodian B may call it code 123, but they both mean the same thing. So for us, it's really about kind of allowing clients the flexibility to define their own rules around how they interpret the data and how they can join and aggregate it all together, right? And then, like I said, it does come back to this idea of kind of the bitemporality and the reproducibility of the data, because coupled with entitlement, which is a very important piece, because with that as a toolkit, you allow clients to kind of build their own workflows and their own customizations for their processes, for their particular problem set. And I think that's kind of the value that we hope to offer our clients in particular.
Oh, awesome. So we've been trying to weave in questions for the audience as we go, and that's actually worked out quite well. As we're approaching the end, one thing I do want to come back to is there's a couple of really interesting extremes here. I don't know how, Craig, your world would deal with manual processes to clean data. It just sounds like the deluge of information you're processing, it's machine or bust, effectively, now, however sophisticated or not. Yet on the KX side, I know you've got some really cool visualization stuff, Rebecca. So where do you draw the line from your perspective in terms of, do we think people have to be completely removed from this loop? Do you think that people have to be in this loop? What's your take on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I suppose when you think about visualization, there's a few different things. I remember working with somebody, a trader at the time, doing some microstructure analysis, right? And we were rebuilding the order book. But the only way that, and that's a tricky thing to do, and to sort of know whether you have it right or not. But actually, the quickest way to sort of identify when you were wrong was to plot it. And then it became very apparent that, this is incorrect. There's an anomaly. There's outliers. Those things are really easy to kind of spot immediately from just on a graph. And I think it's sort of it's a lot more straightforward. What I see a lot is people kind of creating, going a step further than that and putting together kind of complete overview screens. So what is running a series of data quality checks kind of across tables, across databases, across regions, really kind of drilling into the granularity to get that insight into, because as like to Lee's point earlier, you know, how bad is the data? Like, what is it going to affect? And, you know, where is the sort of asterisks? You know, we can still use it in these regions, but this one looks to be off. So kind of putting together those overall summary screens to quickly eyeball it, identify things that maybe didn't jump out in the slew of alert emails, and kind of allowing people to structure their screens in a way that reflects the priorities of their system and their kind of downstream processes. Yeah, that's been a very big very big kind of effort that people have been putting in over the last couple of years. Yeah, and where the visualization has helped.
We'll end up in a world where I think, you know, to be larger, we see also a significant. You can't do data quality on scale without an awful lot of focus on computational approaches. I think, you know, detecting anomalies, you know, to cut to the quick, I think, you know, Craig, you jump out and you embrace them, trying to work out whether there's real value there. Others try to suppress them to make sure they don't distort where we're going. Tolerances, there seems to be no real standards out there. And I think that's a good conversation for another panel in terms of how do we actually, what's the minimum, you know, benchmark that we can actually have on data itself in terms of expectations. We're also starting to see here, yeah, it's fine. And we see this a lot. We love our suppliers, but they typically are only focused on their data. Unsurprisingly, they're commercial organizations that are focusing on their data. Consumers often need to actually fight, you know, corral, wrangle across multiple data sets, not only just the enrichment to join them, but also quality and integrity that many of the suppliers didn't know was there, or even they were needed to support. So it's a very interesting diversion to where this goes. So I'm going to thank our panel, and we're going to wrap up with you know, a couple of insights, if we can, one or two from you guys in terms of what would you leave the audience with. And I'm going to start with Rebecca, and we'll go top.
I get to go first all the time. This is great.
Well, you get to go first.
Thank you. Perfect. Yeah. So I think I would probably talk about 3 different things, right? I'll keep it quick though, hopefully. So a recurring question is, you know, what is normal? How do we identify if things are broken? So just taking that and looking at what you can do from a historical aspect, from real time, and from a prospective perspective. So if you think about it historically, that's where you're going to go. You're going to analyze your data and you're going to develop what is normal. You know, how many records do I typically see in this region? How much of a movement do I typically see in this market, etc. On the real time sort of analyzing or identifying things that are wrong, I kind of think of it a little bit like independent component analysis. And I see a lot of people getting, you know, the corresponding data sets, as Craig was talking about, you know, while the windshield wipers might be saying one thing, where's our second kind of source of truth? So a lot of our customers would get multiple data sets of really the same data to be able to actually accurately identify some of those. And then when you look prospectively and, you know, how do you set your tolerances? What should you be using as those figures? You need to have a kind of a concept of materiality to a certain extent. You know, what is going to be the effect of if this were different by this amount? So those are the 3 things I would kind of encourage people to think about and apply in their organizations.
That was good insight. Riz, next one.
I guess my insight would be that even within an organization, there are multiple normals, there are multiple golden sources, there are multiple views of what good looks like, and you should try and embrace that, not fight it. So, you know, what you need is a toolkit that allows you to kind of store all the data with the highest possible fidelity, reproduce it consistently, apply entitlements over it, and allow you to kind of customize your workflows and toolkits to the flows that make sense to your part or your organization. Right. And I think in doing that, you know, you find yourself in a place where you get the ultimate flexibility because you don't know what's coming down the road in 6 months, a year, 2 years time. You don't want to be ripping up and throwing away your systems. You want something that can evolve with you as your organization evolves. So I think embrace the change and kind of get the toolkits that help you do that.
Sage words. Okay. Great.
Perfect. So I would leave the attendees with you want to have a data-driven process. With our data, we know the frequency of error rates from the different sources of data, and then we implement the knowledge into our development process and methodologies. So really a robust understanding of which data set performs better in this particular instance and with this particular weather value. And then my second thing I would just say, you know, for companies that are relatively new to data or do not have the sophistication or data and analytics savvy, you know, to investigate providers like Crux, who are in the business of making that data usable and accessible, and being able to trust it in having somebody you can trust so that at least you know that the data coming in is of the highest quality.
That's very kind. And last but not least, Lee.
Thank you. You know, one of the things I take away from, you know, would leave the group with is, you know your objective. For me, what I try to do is the worst case scenario is that an investment professional raises a data issue to me, right? So I always want to have things along the way that I can do to mitigate that. And so if I can catch those things in a number of ways, you know, Rebecca mentioned sort of visualization, maybe bubbling up the highest differences so that someone along the way sees it. All really, really good ways of approaching it. I'm not sure there's one magic bullet, but I do think, you know, as you've gathered from this group, everyone does things a little differently and it depends on the data set. So for me, it's avoiding those situations where data can cause a problem for the firm. It's one thing to have to wrestle with it. It's one thing for my team to spend hours on it. That's okay. But I want to keep it, I want to insulate the decision makers of the firm away from those type of things. And leverage really what Craig said, you know, the idea of what Crux brings to the table as a development manager. I want to do less of things in the weeds. I want to do less ETL work myself. My time is better spent. My team's time is better spent making sure the quality of the data is higher, not necessarily dealing with FTP permissions, loading things and bringing them in and setting up schema internally. So I believe the industry is going in that way. I think there's a lot of value in taking your resources, whether it's tech or it's data teams, and applying that to the quality of data versus the nuts and bolts mechanics of bringing it in and working with it.
That's very kind as well. I mean, I absolutely endorse that, as you would expect. So I'd like to thank again our panelists. Really appreciate your insights, some real nuggets that have come out of it, and thank you very much. For the audience, please stay tuned. At the top of the hour, we've got Adam Cardarelli. Adam's the head of product management at Crux, and he's going to be discussing and then demoing how we're extending our offerings in data quality, schema protection, and managing change, the whole gamut. And tomorrow we've got another 4 sessions, so please join us for that. And thank you for joining us today. And with that, I bid you farewell. Thank you.